It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you, so let's make the most of this beautiful
Hey, it's
day.
Dave Rinker here. Here, I'm here with my companions. I'm just going to put them over there. Hopefully they don't fall off the edge of the table. Hey, I'm filling in for John for the next 6 weeks, and we're going to pick up right where he left off last week in Mark chapter 6. And we're going to go from Mark chapter 6, 7, and 8, and that'll set us up really well to finish Mark in the next 6 weeks. So what I want to do is pay attention to a theme that's sort of leavened in this part of the text. Bread is mentioned 16 times between chapter 6 and chapter 8. It's not mentioned again until chapter 14, verse 22, where Jesus actually breaks bread with his companions, with his disciples for the last time. But to pay attention to this theme, I want to introduce just bread as a concept in the ancient world, okay? So just hang with me. So the word in Hebrew is lechem. Say it with me, lechem. You might hear Bet Lechem or Bethlehem in that word. Bethlehem literally means house of bread. And the word lechem, when Hebrew writers are making their point, notice this, they like to relate an idea, a concept, to another idea and concept. They're all about relation, okay? Greek thinking, what you do is show the difference. In Hebrew thinking, you show the likeness. So check this out. The Hebrew word for bread is lechem. The Hebrew word for war, right, conflict, armed conflict, is mil. Got that L in there? Chama. So the word, the root, if you can hear it in there, mil chama, the word for war essentially means, well, it's the thing about bread. It's ultimately about bread, right? War is always about securing bread for your people. That's why kings go to war. And so in the ancient world, in ancient Hebrew thinking, authors of the New Testament, Old Testament, bread was a loaded image. It was also really mysterious, right? In the book of Leviticus, they don't really know how to categorize leavened bread. Is it alive because it's teeming with yeast? Like, what do we do with it? Where does it belong in our symbolic universe? So it's mysterious, right? It is the seed of conflict between nations. And so it serves as a good metaphor when you're making your point. When the New Testament writers pick this theme up and apply it to Jesus, or when Jesus applies it to himself, look at John chapter 6, right? Jesus calling himself the bread from heaven, probably referencing Exodus 16 and Numbers 11, manna, the manna episodes. You see that these images of bread likened to Jesus are just loaded, right? They are teeming. So what we want to do is pay attention to the breadcrumbs that are right, sort of laced between chapter 6 and chapter 8. But I want to look at a bread episode that's early in Mark. Chapter 2, verse 25 and 26. Jesus and his disciples, his companions, are walking along on the Sabbath, and they glean from the edges of a field. Now this raises the question, right? The widow, the orphan, the immigrant, those are the folks that are supposed to glean from the edges of the field. They're the poor, the vulnerable among us. Why are Jesus and his companions gleaning from the edges of the field? Are they poor? Do they have what they need? Do they have enough? And so the religious authorities notice this, and they're like, hey, you can't do it. It's the Sabbath, which is part of a long conversation about how to best observe the law in Jesus' time. And Jesus is like, hey, have you read 1 Samuel 21? Now, the verse numbers weren't there back in the day, but he references David. Have you read when David and his companions, now, David's companions are the mighty men, right? The Ish Gadols, the bad dudes that hung out with David and, did his bidding. So I imagine Peter, right, with Jesus, just being like, looking at the other disciples, dude, we're the mighty men. Letting his imagination sort of dip into that former story and interpret his own. It's kind of like when someone is walking around their house and they're doing all these gestures that someone else whose last name ends with R or begins with R and ends with R does, and they're whistling a tune that seems familiar, but all these gestures like feeding a fish or taking your shoe off or putting on one of these, it sort of makes you think about something else. This is sort of what's going on in the story here. Jesus is the contested king of Israel, much like David. Jesus has companions with him. Now, they're a bunch of teenagers, right? The disciples, they're not the mighty warriors of old, but Jesus is likening him to that. Now, David, when he takes bread from the temple, he takes the bread of the presence, which is bread that is second to only the Ark of the Covenant. There was 12 loaves there that were made weekly, and it symbolized Israel as a whole before God. Bread of the presence, or the bread before God's face. And so David takes 5 loaves. David, this would-be king, this contested king in Israel at the time, takes 5 loaves. Now I want to look at the board to look at how this shows up in Mark chapter 6 through 8. Chapter 6 through 7 and to 8. Now in chapter 6, you have this feeding of the 5,000. Jesus uses 5 loaves, and there is 12 left over. And then there's this water crossing, the walking on water situation, which ends with this odd verse that says, hey, they didn't understand the water crossing, Jesus walking on the water, because their hearts were hardened, and they didn't understand the loaves. Okay? All right. And then in chapter 7, you have this long conversation about clean and unclean. And then it transitions rather quickly to the crumbs that fall from the children's table. This Gentile woman, this Syrophoenician, this Canaanite, Matthew calls her, woman, this woman who's outside Israel, she says, hey, there's enough crumbs to go around. She understands something. And he says, hey, good answer. And so this woman here is praised while the disciples have hardened hearts. And then the episode sort of almost repeats itself, where there's a water crossing and then there's 4,000 being fed. This time Jesus uses 7 loaves. You could almost see that there's a math equation going on here. And then there is 7 loaves left over. Now this one is done in Jewish territory, this one in Gentile territory. And so it begs the question by chapter 8, verse 14, where our text picks up, what is going on with these loaves? I want to pay attention to this woman right over here. So what is it that this Canaanite woman, this Syrophoenician, this Greek woman knows that the disciples don't know? And it seems like, as Mark sort of peers over the disciples, at the readers, us, that we need to know. She knows that there's enough to go around, right? That the crumbs have fallen from the Messiah's table. That, sure, there's enough for Israel, these 12 loaves that are left over, but there's also enough for those 7 Canaanite nations, those Gentile nations that were all mixed up in Israel. There is enough. And this contested king is proof that there is. And so Jesus commends her with good answer in the Common English Bible translation. In Matthew, the parallel story, she's given great faith as opposed to the disciples' little faith. She knows that someone different is on the scene in this Jesus. He has enough. And so it encourages us to think, it might not be bread. Bread can be bread, but maybe it's beans. Maybe it's toilet paper. What are your needs? Do you have enough? And then, do your neighbors have enough? Whatever it is, maybe it's a meal, maybe it's time. is there enough? Now, Jesus, also in Matthew chapter 13, this is verse 33, he likens the kingdom of God, right? This thing that he wants the church to inhabit. He likens the kingdom of God, the reality of God here and now on earth, to a woman who sneaks some yeast. The Greek word sneak or hide is encrypts, okay? Yeast into a batch of 3 measures of flour. Now, there's only a couple spots in the Bible where 3 measures of flour show up. Genesis 18 is a place to look. 3 measures of flour would have made like a village. It would have fed a whole village, right? It's 50 pounds of flour. Jesus' point here is, hey, this is what the kingdom looks like. It looks like a whole village unexpectedly having enough because this woman. May you, in this time of scarcity, of anxiety, may you realize that in Jesus we have enough. May you be open to giving what you have, whatever it is, to your neighbor, to your friend, to a family member. May you make sure that the answer to our question, is there enough, is yes. Peace be with you. Oh, yeah. Woo! There it is, 1 loaf.